for now, I'll introduce our second speaker, Floris de Lange, who is a professor at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. He earned his PhD with cum laude at Radboud as well, with Ivan Tony in 2008, where he investigated mental simulations of perception and action in the brain using fMRI and MEG. He did his postdoc work in the lab of Stanislas Dehaene in Paris at Neurospin, examining neural dynamics of consciousness and unconscious decision making. And then he returned to Radboud in 2009 to establish the Predictive Brain Lab at the Donders Institute. And they investigate prior knowledge, which modifies perception and decision-making in both health and disease. And so today we're going to hear him speak about laminar profiles associated with prediction, attention, as well as bottom-up inputs. So Floris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. Also, thanks to Andre for the previous talk, really interesting. I have lots of questions related to that talk as well, but we'll get to that at the end. So for now, let's dive in. So I think I already kind of give away the message of my talk at the title slide. So if you really are drowsy, then you can just basically remember this title slide. So, but indeed, as Andrew said, what I'm going to try to do is to distinguish different top-down modulations, but in particular, our ability to predict events based on prior knowledge and our ability to selectively attend to events, and see how the laminar profile of that may also differ from bottom-up input. So thanks very much for the invitation also. And to start off, well, we know that that when we're trying to perceive the world, so that our vision is strongly helped by background knowledge, by things we have learned in the past. So for example, in the top two rows, you see some examples of occlusion, where you can effortlessly understand that this is a triangle, this is a circle, etc. Or even here, these more complex shapes that they refer to different letters of the alphabet, even though the input is actually fairly impoverished. And your ability to do this, in this case, is probably to a strong degree dependent on the knowledge that you have, that you bring with you when you want to perceive this. And then this kind of knowledge can also be used against us in a way, like for example, in the bottom row, where you see this tiger crawling through the jungle. We can see the tiger, but you can also see that in this kind of evolutionary arms race of not trying to be seen, that the tiger has also sort of camouflaged itself, such to actually sort of that our background knowledge maybe leads us astray here and thinks that we're just looking at a bush of leaves. And the right bottom case is a sort of more extreme version of that. I think some of you might just see a wall here, but without anything remarkable in this wall. However, if you look at this particular part of the wall, you might be kind of amazed, at least I was amazed when I first saw this picture, that you fail to see something that is actually quite present, namely in this case, the cigar. But the cigar is oriented such that that in this case, your visual system kind of just explains it away as part of the wall if you haven't seen it. So now you know that there's a cigar. Obviously, you cannot actually unsee the cigar anymore. So this is actually also sort of a powerful demonstration that having given you this knowledge, this has also altered your perception in a pretty fundamental way. All right, so that's kind of like the background. That's what my lab is interested in. We're interested in this interplay between prior knowledge and perception. And well, one way to think about how prior knowledge should be incorporated in perception is given by this very famous Bayes theorem, which is a mathematical formula that describes the normative way of so the best possible way, the optimal way to combine different sources of knowledge to arrive at the best possible inference. But obviously, this is just a mathematical formula. It doesn't really speak to the neural implementation or of maybe an approximation of this. And as many of you will know, the last decade or 2 decades maybe, has really seen an increased interest in how the brain might be operating according to these kind of Bayesian principles, implemented by potentially feedback processes. So that, for example, neurons in higher order areas might provide priors that help constrain the processing of lower order areas and thereby sort of providing a neural approximation of Bayesian inference. Now, what am I actually going to talk about? So I'm mostly going to focus, actually exclusively going to focus my talk on early visual cortex, particularly the primary visual cortex. Not because that's the most exciting area in the brain, but because it's very easy to study it, and the basic properties of V1, the bottom-up properties, I might say, are fairly well described. Now, the upshot of the talk, or what am I going to try to convince you of, based on not just neuroanatomical studies, but actually sort of non-invasive laminar fMRI studies from the lab, is that there's segregation between input signals, which, as many of you know, sort of textbook knowledge has it that they predominantly arrive in the middle layer, layer 4 of a particular cortical area, then kind of cycle on or through that cortical column, and then from there on, from the superficial layers, sort of target again the middle layer of the next cortical area. But that there is sort of different top-down processes that target different layers. So, and what sort of the upshot from the studies that I'll present today will be that particularly these prediction signals, these filling in signals, these signals related to inference, that they particularly target deep layers of a cortical area, whereas precision signals or attention signals, in other words, signals that are used to kind of increase the precision of a cortical representation, that they predominantly target superficial layers, so that the effect of that top-down effect is particularly visible in the superficial layers. So that's going to be the summary, but let's see how I get to that summary. So I'm going to start with the prediction part. So as I already mentioned, the visual world is highly predictable. So even though, or even in the case that you are now, you're sitting behind your computer and most of your visual world will actually remain stable. And this predictability in the world can actually help, for example, in the sense that higher order structure can constrain the interpretation of sort of like simpler elements. To give an example of this is a famous example from a TICS paper from Haute Oliva. And what she shows here is kind of a street scene, sort of a blurry street scene, where most of you will probably recognize this as a building, and then this might be a sort of a car that is parked by the side of the road, whereas this element over here might be a pedestrian that is crossing this road. And the interesting trick here is that this car and the pedestrian are actually the same input. So there is no difference here between those two elements, except for a 90-degree rotation. So what has happened here is that the context in this case, again, sort of the higher order, higher level structure, has kind of constrained your interpretation of these elements. So there is nothing sort of like car-like or person-like in this bottom-up input, but rather in this case, the context helps you to sort of automatically interpret this in one of two ways. Now, this is something that we were interested in, and Peter Koch, by then still a grad student in my lab, came up with the idea that we could study this process in a very clean way by capitalizing on a very famous illusion, the Kinetic Illusion. And the Kinetic Illusion is the following one. If I show you this bottom-up input, you basically all just see 4 Pac-Man that are oriented in a particular way. If I now sort of slightly rearrange these Pac-Man, you will sort of magically almost a triangle will appear that is kind of now positioned on top of 3 circles. So your perceptual interpretation has dramatically changed, even though the bottom-up input is actually only subtly changed. And some of you might even see sort of this part of the screen as brighter as sort of the surrounding parts, or someone might see sort of an illusory line over here. And this is, of course, due to the fact that due to Gestalt principles of good continuation, your visual system has made an inference here. But this inference is interestingly sort of based on, well, obviously it's based on some bottom-up input, but there is an inference, for example, that there's a line over here, or that there is like a figure over here that is basically not backed by bottom-up input. This inference is based just on a higher order knowledge, you could say. Now, the idea that we wanted to test with this illusion is the idea that feedback may sort of activate a certain perceptual hypothesis. So we all know that there is this kind of feed-forward pathway from V1 to V2, etc., along the ventral stream. But obviously, there's also a strong reciprocal feedback from, for example, TE to TEO, etc. And the feedback seems to be about as numerous as feed-forward. So in that sense, there is like a strong potential for feedback processes to also weigh in on perceptual processing and to change our final perceptual interpretation. And the idea that we wanted to test here is that feedback, for example, from a higher order area like LO, or in monkeys, this would perhaps correspond to TEO or TE, that this feedback from areas like this to lower order areas that are just signaling edges on much larger, on much smaller spatial scales, that this feedback may sort of activate a perceptual hypothesis, even in the absence of bottom-up evidence. And this is what you could call sort of a prediction. And we were encouraged by some electrophysiological findings that are already quite old from the lab of Tai-Seng Lee, that found that indeed when you are, so what they looked here at the neural response, so simple spikes in V1 for different type of stimuli. So obviously when they presented a line in the receptive field of a V1 neuron at the optimal orientation, this led to strong spiking activity. But in this study, they found that there was also an elevated spiking activity for illusory contours. So when there was no line, but when there was sort of an inferred line based on this illusory contour. And when they looked at the time course of this illusory contour spiking activity, they also saw that this time course showed much later activity compared to the feed-forward activity that you get for presenting a line. So this is all sort of suggestive of an activation of a primary visual cortex, but not in a feed-forward way, but rather in a feedback way that occurs later in time. Now, when we tried similar illusion on human participants, this is a somewhat older study from Peter Cobb, what we found is that there is like increased activity in voxels that have their receptive field overlying the triangle, the illusory triangle. So what you're looking at here is kind of an activity map, a heat map of activity in the primary visual cortex, but now not in the space of, not in sort of neuroanatomical space, but already sort of coded for the receptive field of the voxel. So we use the population receptive field method to kind of work out for each voxel which location it responded to in retinotopic frame of reference. And then what you see is that for all these different illusory triangles, you see that there's like an increased activity at the area where the illusory triangle is represented. And this was actually independent of the task. So it was independent of whether people were attending to this triangle or not. So this doesn't seem to be an attention effect, but rather like an automatic perceptual filling in effect. Now let's get to the layer result. So what Peter subsequently did is to simply redo this study. So to again look at the activity profile of illusory triangles, but now at much larger precision, so much higher acuity. And what we used for this study, and actually all the studies I'll present today, is gradient echo EPI sequences that employ 0.8 millimeter isotropic resolution. Now that's good, but you could still say that most voxels are actually still containing then a mixture of different layers, because obviously the voxels are not going to sort of nicely sit in one of the layers. So even if you kind of partition your layers into three, like the superficial layer, the middle layer, and the deep layer, which are conveniently sort of roughly similar in size. But even then, of course, the voxels are not going to sit nicely in one of them. So what we additionally employed here is a spatial GLM method that aims to kind of unconfound sort of these partial contributions from different layers. So for each voxel, we estimated the proportion to which this voxel sits in the superficial, the middle, and in the deep layers. And this, again, is going to be the method that I'm going to employ for all the studies that I showed today. Now, when we just look at overall activity, again, in this kind of like world-centered format or retin-topic format, we see again that there's like an increase in activity when you compare illusory triangles to non-illusory triangles, to non-illusory stimuli. And again, in the receptive field overlying the voxels that code for the triangle. But now, of course, we can also look into those and see which layers are actually showing this differential activity. And this is what you see here. So this is again showing the activity difference between illusory and non-illusory figure, but now split for the different layers. And what we see here is that this difference in signal for between illusory and non-illusory figure is particularly is limited to the deep layers. It's really confined to the deep layers, and we do not find it in the middle or the superficial layers. Okay, so sort of interesting kind of converging evidence from a different laminar fMRI study comes from a very recent study by Peter Cock as a senior author, because I didn't have anything to do with this study. This is a study that Peter did in his new capacity as PI at UCL, at the Functional Imaging Laboratory. And what he looked at here is predictions of a very different nature, namely simply by giving people cues that predicted a certain orientation of a grating, and then occasionally omitting that stimulus. He was interested to see whether those kind of omission trials, where there is a very specific prediction, namely the cue tells you whether there's going to be a clockwise or a counterclockwise grating, to then see whether these omissions, these predictions, generate a stimulus-specific activity in V1, as well as what the laminar profile of this is. And indeed, what Peter's lab found here was that there is stimulus-specific activity in V1. This is something that we found already before, but that the laminar profile of this stimulus-specific activity for these omission trials looks very similar again. So it's again limited to the deep layers, larger in the deep layers and larger than in the middle or the superficial layers, which is quite different from the activity profile for an actual stimulus. Typically, when you present stimuli, you see this kind of patterns where you get more activity when you go to the peel surface, which can be simply due to to some various confounds and that relates to bolt signals kind of draining from the deep towards the superficial layers. So this is another sort of corroborating piece of evidence, I would say, that when you just purely look at prediction activity in the absence of any bottom-up input, that this is typically associated with the activation of deep layers. Now let's switch gears to a different cognitive process that might more relate to the process of attention. And the process that I'm going to look at for this one is visual working memory. And I would say that visual working memory is basically the generation and attention to a mental image in your, for example, in your mind's eye. So for example, if I give you this stimulus and I ask you what kind of letter this is, what you would probably do is kind of mentally rotate this image into an upright R and then sort of inspect your mental image and say, okay, this is an R, this is not a mirror image of an R. So that is what I mean with visual working memory. So it's like when you take an image that is no longer visible in front of your eyes and attend to those internal contents. Now, a very famous paradigm to do this is something that was pioneered by the group of Frank Thon, where they presented people with two samples and then use a retrocue to ask them to either keep in working memory sample 1 or sample 2. So for example, in this case, Q would be digit 2. So at that stage, people would know that they would have to keep in mind this particular stimulus for a very long period of time, in this case, 11 seconds. And then after these 11 seconds, they would get a test probe and they would need to say, is this test probe like clockwise or counterclockwise with respect to what you have in mind. And that is a very effective way to see also whether people can keep stimuli in visual working memory to make this task difficult. Now, what Frank Tong found when he did this is that when you look at overall bolt signal, you get, of course, a bolt signal for the two stimuli or for the two samples. You also get a bolt signal for the test stimulus, but in between there is this kind of, the bolt signal kind of goes back to near baseline levels. But at the same time, when he trained the machine learning algorithm to try to classify between these two stimuli, he showed that you can actually quite well classify which stimulus people were keeping in mind. So there is information in the activity patterns during this delay period about what stimulus people are actually sort of internally attending to or keeping in working memory. And Anke Marit from my lab found out that this actually is due to the fact that there is a very small but reliable difference, obviously, in activity between sort of voxels that prefer the stimulus that you keep in working memory and voxels that prefer the other orientation. So this is kind of the overall bolt signal for those two populations, so the solid and the dotted one. You can see that there's only a very tiny difference. But when you actually take this difference, sort of just plot the difference in percent signal change, you can see that it's quite reliable and that it mirrors perfectly sort of the decoding accuracy that you find with a machine learning algorithm. So in other words, the machine learning algorithm relies on a small but very reliable difference in activity between a population that encodes one orientation and a population that encodes the other orientation. And that's good news because that's basically the signal that we're going to use again to see what is kind of the laminar profile of this activity difference. So we used exactly this task. So where we have two samples, then a queue, and then finally a probe. And we asked the questions of what is the laminar distribution of stimulus-specific working memory activity? Now, here you see, again, the overall bolt signal for the voxels that like the stimulus that you keep in working memory and for the voxels that like the opposite stimulus. So we can again reproduce this basic effect that there's like more activity, obviously, in the voxels that like the stimulus that you keep in working memory. And note again that this is not driven by the stimulus, cannot be driven by the stimulus because both stimuli are shown. And then afterwards, the subject keeps in mind one of them. And when we look at the laminar profile of this activity difference, so just we take this difference here in this interval here between the stimulus and the probe, what we then find is that it kind of seems to avoid the middle layer. So you see the largest activity difference in the deep layer as well as in the superficial layers. And both of these are significantly larger than the middle layer. And this is particularly true for the primary visual cortex. So we find a very similar effect in V2 and V3 when we look at the overall bolt signal. So also in V2 and V3, you have this working memory signal, which is very reliable. But when we look at those areas, we actually do not see any kind of reliable difference between the different layers. So this kind of avoidance of the middle layer seems to be specific in this case to the primary visual cortex. And the way we interpret this, although this is entirely speculative, is that this mental imagery or visual working memory related activity is related to feedback, is a mechanism that kind of feeds back all the way to the primary visual cortex. But having activated the primary visual cortex, that activity might actually kind of propagate back again to the later areas, thereby sort of activating the entire cortical column. That would sort of generate a pattern like the pattern we're seeing. So you might then ask, so why wouldn't it propagate back all the way to the thalamus? And that might be related to the fact that we're looking here at an orientation-based signal, while the thalamus doesn't seem to have reliable orientation coding. And we were kind of pleased to see that a study from the lab of Peter Roelsema that Andre also had on his slides show fairly similar results when looking at activity profiles for working memory related signals in V1 in a very different species and task. So here you see the current source density plots that show this kind of V-shaped pattern in V1 that is very similar to the V-shaped pattern in V1 that we see here with our bolt signals. All right, now my final study is going to look at attentional signals. And here we wanted to sort of distinguish in one go between activity modulations in V1 that are induced by a top-down selective mechanism versus a bottom-up contrast increase mechanism. Now, how do you do that? So let's look at this stimulus here. This is a plate stimulus that has two orientations. Now, one thing you can, of course, do is to simply increase the contrast. So you go from a low contrast to a high contrast grading. And our idea was that that should maybe particularly increase activity in the bottom-up direction, because the bottom-up increases the signal from the eyes to the V1. Another thing you could, of course, do is to ask people to either attend the clockwise or the counterclockwise stripes of this composite grading. So if you're attending one of those stripes of the plate stimulus, we know that that also can lead to an increase in activity, but in this case, it's not related to any bottom-up change, but in this case, just a selective attention change. So that's basically what we did. And in that case, we were hypothesizing that that would lead to changes in, again, the agranular layers. Now, this is the task. So again, sort of borrowed from another paper from Frank Tong's lab. And this is basically a feature-based attention task. So what we do here is we have a block design where we flash these, or we present these kind of gratings. And for a duration of 16 seconds, we ask people, for example, to detect small changes in the spatial frequency of one of those orientations. So that is our attentional manipulation. And the bottom-up manipulation is simply varying the contrast between 30 and 80% Michelson contrast. Now, this is just to show you that that works really well. So we basically find two main effects that both increase activity in the visual system. So for example, when we look at the attention effect, when we look at the contrast effect. So when we just compare high with low, high contrast, low contrast, you can see that particularly in V1, that leads to a massive increase in activity, but also in V2 and V3. And that is the case for the attended, but also for the unattended feature. And at the same time, you see that when we just look at the attention effect, so we now compare within one contrast level, the attended and the unattended feature, you can see that there again, there's also an increase in activity when you go from unattended to attended. So this was, of course, we were really happy to see this, because this meant that we actually have an activity difference, or we have two activity effects, a main effect of contrast and a main effect of attention. And now we can dive in again and see what is the laminar profile of those activity modulations. Now, this is what I'm showing you here. So this is now attended versus unattended. Here, first overall, the overall bolt signal. Obviously, you see that when you attend, so the attended feature shows a larger bolt signal than the unattended one. You may think that this is a really small effect, but that's of course also due to the fact that here we have to sort voxels by orientation preference. And many of those voxels will actually like both orientations. So this is a fairly insensitive method, but that's what we're doing. So this is the attention contrast. And when we again look at the laminar profile of this, you can see that this has this kind of a profile where you get sort of the largest activity in the superficial, a little bit less in the middle, and a little bit less in the deep. So this is a profile that can relate to a fairly unspecific activity modulation. But what you can also see is that it is quite different from the activity modulation by contrast. So when we compare the bolt signal between high contrast and low contrast, now you see that the activity profile peaks actually in the middle cortical layer and is larger there than in either the deep or the superficial layers. And this difference, sort of this laminar, so when we calculate whether the activity modulation is more in the agranular or more in the granular layer, you see that for attention, it's slightly more in the agranular layer. For contrast, it's much larger in the granular layer. And this difference is indeed sort of highly significant. And this is when you just plot it for every individual subject, you see that almost all subjects have this effect in the same direction as the mean. So these are all the subjects that show the effect in the direction that you also find on average. And then there's a few subjects that show the effect in the opposite direction. All right, so that brings me to the end. So this is going to be my conclusion. So when we look at this kind of cortical circuit, where we know from anatomy that feed-forward signals tend to arrive in the middle layer, whereas feedback signals tend to avoid the middle layer, I think our findings, our laminar bold findings, are compatible with that, which I think is reassuring. But they also provide a little bit more detail in the sense that it looks like prediction signals, so signals that are related to sort of providing sort of predictions to perceptual inference, seem to be particularly targeting the deep layers, whereas attentional signals, both in the context of a stimulus that is present and a stimulus that is not present, so that this working memory study, so those signals seem to target more the superficial layers. Okay, and with that, I have come to the end of my talk. So I should thank the people who did this work, and that is, so Peter Koch was instrumental in starting up this research line. He was a PhD student and postdoc in my lab. He's by now a PI at Phil in London, where he's still also pursuing this line of research. So keep him in mind. And Sam Lawrence was a postdoc in my lab who particularly worked on the working memory and attentional signals. And finally, if you are a postdoc and you are interested in this work, we will be, the lab will be advertising a position later this year, exactly looking more into the laminar origin of these signals. So if you are or know anybody who will be interested in this, please get in touch with me. Okay, thank you very much.